In 2008, inside a house so quiet it felt abandoned, David Foster Wallace ended his life after stopping the antidepressant he had depended on for more than 20 years. The man who wrote over 1,000 pages dissecting human consciousness, who foresaw a culture addicted to entertainment and trapped in loneliness, was finally crushed by his own mind. The author of Infinite Jest understood pain, analyzed it, named it with surgical precision, and still lost to it, leaving behind one unbearable question. If peak intelligence cannot save a human being, then what can? In 1996, David Foster Wallace published Infinite Jest, a novel that exceeded 1,000 pages and splintered into hundreds of footnotes, an act that felt almost hostile to a culture already losing its ability to focus. What many dismissed as excess was, in fact, design. Wallace was not showing off intelligence. He was replicating the experience of a mind overwhelmed by stimuli, choices, and compulsions it could no longer control. The book demanded effort because modern consciousness, he believed, was already exhausted. The world did not know what to do with it at first. Critics called the novel unreadable, unmarketable, even self-indulgent. Then something unexpected happened. Writers, professors, and students began to recognize themselves inside its pages. Wallace had articulated addiction not only as substance abuse, but as a structural condition of modern life. Entertainment replacing meaning, pleasure crowding out purpose, irony becoming emotional armor. Without smartphones, without social media, he described a future that felt uncomfortably familiar. Almost overnight, Wallace became a cult figure. He was labeled a writer's writer, invited to interviews, campuses, and literary panels. Lecture halls filled. His sentences were quoted with reverence. Yet the man himself appeared uncomfortable with the attention. Soft-spoken, self-effacing, often visibly anxious, he repeatedly warned that intelligence was not salvation. In interviews, he spoke about depression as something persistent and physical, not philosophical. He insisted that awareness could sharpen suffering rather than dissolve it. The irony deepened with every accolade. Wallace was praised for diagnosing the sickness of an entire culture, but diagnosis did not equal cure. His greatest achievement explained the trap with terrifying clarity, yet offered no exit for the person who built it. And as readers celebrated Infinite Jest as prophetic, an unsettling question lingered beneath the praise. If someone who sees a system from the inside cannot escape it, what hope does anyone else have? Born in 1962 in Ithaca, New York, David Foster Wallace grew up in a household where intelligence was not a gift, but a baseline. His father was a philosophy professor, his mother an English teacher. Language, argument, and precision were part of daily life. From an early age, Wallace learned that thinking clearly, speaking well, and analyzing deeply were how one earned attention, approval, and belonging. And when a child learns that their worth is tied to how well they think, what happens the moment thinking no longer feels safe? Wallace stood out almost immediately. Exceptionally bright, academically gifted, and competitive in junior tennis, he was praised for speed of thought and depth of understanding. But alongside that praise grew something quieter and more dangerous, a mind that never rested. He didn't simply observe the world. He monitored himself inside it. Every action was evaluated, every feeling questioned, every moment filtered through analysis. Instead of living experiences, he processed them. And when the mind becomes a primary place of residence, where does the body go? By adolescence, the first clear signs of depression appeared. Not dramatic breakdowns, but a persistent heaviness, difficulty sleeping, fading motivation, a sense of emptiness without an obvious cause. Outwardly, Wallace remained a high achiever, the student teachers admired and parents were proud of. Inwardly, he was confronting a fatigue that accomplishment could not erase. Success quieted the noise briefly, then made it louder. The question formed early and refused to leave. If doing everything right still feels wrong, where does the problem actually live? College at Amherst intensified the pattern. Wallace studied philosophy and literature simultaneously, disciplines that demand relentless self-reflection. He excelled at a rare level. His philosophy thesis was later published academically, while his creative thesis revealed an unusual, restless literary voice. Yet this was also where the central contradiction sharpened. The more he understood about consciousness, desire, and meaning, the more clearly he saw their limits. Knowledge did not bring relief. It expanded the territory of anxiety. Awareness did not free him. It trapped him inside endless observation. During this period, antidepressants entered Wallace's life not as enhancement, but as survival. He wasn't seeking happiness. He was trying to function, to wake up, attend class, speak to people, exist without being crushed by thought. Slowly, a brutal realization settled in. The mind that defined him was also his greatest threat. He could analyze pain faster than he could feel it. He could describe despair with precision, but could not step outside it. And a deeper fear followed close behind. If that intelligence ever failed, if his thinking dulled or collapsed, what would be left? Relationships reflected the same tension. Wallace wanted connection, but feared exposure. Being known meant risking disappointment, or worse, being ordinary. Intimacy felt dangerous, so he controlled instead of surrendered, explained instead of felt. Writing emerged not as ambition, but as regulation, a way to impose structure on chaos, to slow the mental spin just enough to breathe. But even that reinforced a habit. Everything had to be processed, justified, framed. Nothing could simply exist. There was no singular trauma in Wallace's childhood, no obvious villain. What made it dangerous was its subtlety, a world that perfectly rewarded intellect while leaving little room for fragility, a system that trained vigilance but never taught rest. By the time he stepped toward a literary life, the foundation was set. A mind trained to see everything, a nervous system stretched thin by that vision, and a belief that letting go of thought itself might be catastrophic. And beneath it all lingered a question that would follow him for decades. When a person is taught how to think endlessly, who teaches them how to stop? After Amherst, David Foster Wallace did not move toward literary stardom. He moved inward. Graduate school was not a launch pad. It was a holding pattern. He enrolled in creative writing programs, partly to keep writing, partly to stay afloat. The ambition was there, but was muted by fear. Fear of fraudulence. Fear of being seen too clearly. Fear that whatever talent he had might already be running out. Writing was not a ladder. It was a brace. His first novel, The Broom of the System, arrived early and earned attention for its cleverness and intellectual play. Reviewers noticed the brain. Wallace noticed the problem. The book leaned heavily on irony, systems, and games, exactly the mode he was already beginning to distrust. Praise did not reassure him. It confirmed a suspicion that cleverness alone was a dead end. If irony was armor, then writing that relied on it risked becoming emotionally vacant. And if readers admired the armor, how would they ever reach the person inside? During this period, depression tightened its grip. Medication became a constant companion, not a solution, maintenance. Days were organized around managing symptoms. Sleep, focus, basic function. Wallace wrote in bursts, then stalled. He taught. He revised obsessively. He threw away pages. He began to articulate a private rule for himself. Writing must risk sincerity, even if sincerity made him look naive or exposed. Anything less felt dishonest. The problem was that sincerity demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability felt unsafe. He turned away from the idea of the cool writer, away from detachment, away from postmodern smirks. What interested him instead was the inner weather of ordinary people, the silent negotiations, the compulsions no one admits to, the way desire masquerades as choice. He wanted prose that could hold attention without numbing emotion, that could be difficult without being cruel. This wasn't a market strategy. It was a moral one, and moral commitments carry weight. Financially, life was unstable. Teaching positions were temporary. Recognition came in fragments. He lived modestly, often alone, often restless. Social interactions drained him. Interviews felt like performances. He did not understand how to stop performing. The gap between public expectation and private capacity widened. He feared becoming a talking head before he had finished saying anything that mattered. At the same time, his notebooks thickened. Sentences grew longer, more recursive, more precise. Footnotes began to appear, not as decoration, but as a way to represent how thought actually behaves. Interruptive, self-correcting, compulsive. Wallace wasn't experimenting for novelty. He was trying to be accurate. The form followed the mind. And the mind, he knew, was not linear. This was a period where the private path solidified. Wallace stopped writing to impress and started writing to confront. He read widely: philosophy, recovery literature, pop culture, math. He studied addiction not as a topic, but as a structure. He noticed how entertainment promised relief while demanding submission, how choice multiplied anxiety instead of freedom, how attention, once fragmented, was hard to reclaim. These ideas were not abstractions. They mirrored his own daily negotiations with thought and mood. Yet even as the work deepened, the cost rose. Writing at this level required immersion, and immersion meant prolonged contact with the very mental states he was trying to manage. Progress felt fragile. A good day could collapse without warning. He worried that the discipline he needed to write was the same discipline that kept him rigid and afraid to rest. The paradox sharpened. Writing stabilized him, but also pulled him closer to the edge. By the early 1990s, it was clear he was moving towards something larger, riskier, and harder than anything he had attempted. A book that would not flatter readers. A book that would demand attention in a culture trained to avoid it. A book that would tell the truth about pleasure, addiction, and loneliness without offering easy relief. He knew the direction. He also knew the danger. And the question pressing forward, quiet but insistent, was this: if writing required him to face everything he was trying to survive, how long could that balance possibly hold? By 1996, David Foster Wallace crossed a threshold few writers ever approach. The publication of Infinite Jest did not merely add a title to his resume. It reorganized his life. The book arrived like an object from another system. Oversized, demanding, structurally disobedient. Readers did not consume it. They submitted to it. And in a culture already drifting towards speed and distraction, submission felt radical. Recognition followed fast and unevenly. Sales were strong. Reviews were polarized. Some critics mocked the difficulty. Others admitted, reluctantly, that the novel captured something they could not escape in themselves. Word spread through universities, workshops, and late-night conversations. Wallace became a reference point, a signal. If you understood this book, it said something about how seriously you took thought, attention, and inner life. The halo formed quickly, and it was heavy. Publicly, Wallace was framed as a generational voice. Privately, he felt more exposed and elevated. Interviews multiplied. Journalists wanted him to explain what the book meant, as if it were a thesis rather than a mirror. He answered patiently, often deflecting praise, emphasizing that intelligence was not virtue and difficulty was not depth. But every explanation fixed his image a little more firmly. The room for error narrowed. Lecture halls filled wherever he went. Students lined up with marked copies, asking for signatures, for meaning, for reassurance that attention still mattered. Wallace spoke carefully, choosing humility over authority, but the audience still heard guidance. He was becoming, against his will, a teacher of how to live in an age of excess. And the expectation was relentless. Clarity from someone who struggled daily to maintain it. The essays added to the aura. Pieces on television, sports, cruise ships, and consumer culture revealed the same pattern. Humor layered over dread, observation laced with warning. He could dissect pleasure until it showed its cost. He could trace how choice quietly turned into compulsion. Readers felt understood and unsettled at the same time. That tension fueled his reputation. It also fed his exhaustion. One moment seemed to crystallize the public Wallace. A commencement speech, later known as This Is Water, stripped away complexity and favored directness. It spoke about awareness, about choosing how to see, about the quiet heroism of attention. The speech spread far beyond a ceremony, quoted and replayed as a guide to sanity. For many, it was life-affirming. For Wallace, it was another instance of being heard as resolved when he felt anything but. Behind the scenes, the work took its toll. Fame did not bring relief. It amplified scrutiny. He worried constantly about repeating himself, about disappointing readers, about being trapped by the very techniques that made the book succeed. The pressure to follow Infinite Jest was something equally significant, hovered like a deadline that never arrived. Writing slowed. Revision multiplied. Silence became frightening. Depression remained present, managed but never absent. Medication held the edges together, but the center felt fragile. Success did not quiet the mind. It sharpened it. The more people expected insight, the more he feared losing access to it. The gap between the public image of mastery and the private experience of effort widened until it felt dishonest to stand in front of audiences at all. Relationships strained under the weight. Being admired is not the same as being known, and Wallace felt the difference acutely. He wanted ordinary connection, but his work had made him extraordinary in ways that resisted ordinariness. Conversations drifted back to the book, to ideas, to meaning. Escape was temporary. At the height of his influence, Wallace understood the irony with painful clarity. He was praised for diagnosing the sickness of a culture that could not stop distracting itself, while his own days were spent managing an internal version of that same condition. Attention was his subject. Attention was also his battleground. And as the applause continued, a quieter question grew harder to ignore. If this is what victory looks like, visibility without peace, admiration without rest, what exactly has been won? At the center of David Foster Wallace's life was not sadness in the ordinary sense, but clinical, grinding depression that behaved less like emotion and more like physics. It had weight. It pressed. It returned with mathematical certainty. This was not despair caused by failure or loss. It existed independently of circumstance, advancing quietly even during periods of success. Wallace did not romanticize it. He described it as exhausting, humiliating, and relentless, a condition that required constant management just to remain upright. For more than 2 decades, antidepressants were not optional. They were structural. They allowed him to wake up, teach, write, speak, function. The medication did not make him happy. It made life tolerable, and that distinction mattered. Wallace understood that his survival depended on chemistry as much as willpower. Yet even as the drugs kept him alive, they carried their own costs. Emotional flattening, physical side effects, a sense that his inner life was being held together by external scaffolding. The question he never fully escaped was whether the version of himself stabilized by medication was still truly himself. His intelligence, so often mistaken for control, became a liability here. Wallace could observe his own suffering in real time, narrate it internally, analyze its mechanisms, predict its cycles. But observation did not interrupt it. Awareness did not soften the blow. If anything, it intensified the experience. There was no refuge in ignorance. The mind that saw everything also felt everything and could not look away. Writing, once a form of regulation, began to mirror the struggle. Pages grew dense, recursive, precise to the point of pain. Every sentence carried the burden of accuracy, the fear of simplification. Wallace did not want to misrepresent experience, especially suffering. But fidelity came at a price. To write honestly about despair required proximity to it. Each project demanded extended immersion in the very states he was fighting to survive. Progress was real, but so was erosion. Publicly, he spoke carefully about depression, refusing metaphors that made it sound poetic. Privately, the effort to remain functional consumed enormous energy. Ordinary tasks, emails, conversations, commitments, required calculation. Teaching drained him. Travel destabilized routines. Interviews demanded a version of himself that felt increasingly distant from his daily reality. The gap between what people expected and what he could sustainably provide widened until it felt dangerous. Relationships suffered under the strain. Intimacy requires a degree of unpredictability, and Wallace lived by control. Not control over others, but overexposure. He feared being a burden. He feared being seen as weak. He feared that if the internal machinery failed in front of someone else, it would confirm his worst suspicion, that without constant management, he was unlivable. So he withdrew when pressure rose, isolating not out of indifference, but out of caution. At the same time, his themes narrowed and sharpened. Addiction ceased to be a topic and became a framework. Not just substances, but habits of thought, entertainment, self-consciousness, the endless loop of desire and dissatisfaction. Wallace recognized in culture what he experienced internally, the promise of relief that always demanded more attention, more compliance, more surrender. The parallels were not theoretical. They were lived. What made this period especially brutal was the absence of narrative progress. There was no steady descent, no dramatic crash, just maintenance, adjustment, vigilance. Depression did not announce itself with spectacle. It waited, and Wallace understood that understanding itself did not guarantee safety. He could explain the trap, he could map it, he could warn others about it. But explanation did not create an exit. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the effort required to maintain equilibrium had become his full-time occupation. Writing was slower, days were shorter, the margin for error narrowed, and beneath everything lay a quiet, accumulating fear that the system keeping him alive might not hold forever, that one change, chemical, physical, or circumstantial, could undo years of balance in an instant. If survival depended on constant vigilance, what would happen the moment vigilance failed? In the early 2000s, the balance holding David Foster Wallace together began to feel provisional. The medication that had stabilized him for years was losing effectiveness, its side effects growing harder to tolerate. Emotional flattening deepened. Physical discomfort increased. The sense of living behind glass, present but dulled, became harder to justify. Wallace faced a decision that terrified him: remain chemically intact but increasingly numb, or risk removing the scaffolding and face whatever returned. The choice to taper off medication was not impulsive. It was deliberate, cautious, supervised. He hoped that time, discipline, and routine might replace chemistry. For a while, he believed it was working. He taught, he wrote, he maintained schedules. Friends noticed effort, even optimism. But beneath the surface, something darker was gathering momentum. The depression did not return gradually. It surged. The symptoms came back sharper, heavier, and more resistant than before, as the illness had been waiting. Sleep collapsed first. Nights stretched into hours of restless awareness. Thoughts looped without pause. The mind that once raced now pinned him in place. Days followed with exhaustion layered on dread. Concentration vanished. Writing stalled completely. Not because ideas were gone, but because accessing them felt physically impossible. The very activity that had once regulated his inner life now required an energy he no longer possessed. What made this phase unbearable was not simply pain, but its persistence. Wallace had endured suffering before. He had managed it, negotiated with it, worked around it. This time felt different. There were no windows of relief, no reliable routines to anchor him. The future shrank into a series of immediate obstacles. Get through today, then the next hour, then the next minute. The analytical mind that once provided distance now offered only brutal clarity. He could see the trajectory. He could see how this ended if nothing changed. Friends and colleagues sensed the danger. Concern increased. Support was offered. But depression of the severity does not respond easily to reassurance. Wallace did not doubt that people cared. He doubted that care could reach him through the density of the illness. The fear of being a burden intensified. Asking for help felt like transferring weight. He could not justify placing on others. Silence felt perversely more responsible. The themes he had written about for years, addiction, captivity, the tyranny of desire, collapsed inward. The addiction was no longer cultural. It was neurological. The cage was no longer metaphorical. It was chemical. Wallace understood with devastating precision that willpower was not the missing ingredient. Effort was not the problem. The machinery itself was malfunctioning. By 2008, the situation had narrowed to a point of unbearable focus. The question was no longer how to live well, or how to write truthfully, or how to be useful to others. It was how to stop the pain without causing more of it. In that narrowed frame, options collapsed. Continuation looked endless and unmanageable. Intervention felt uncertain. Waiting felt dangerous. When the end came, it was not framed as drama or protest. It was an act of escape from a state that had become intolerable. The man who had spent his life articulating the invisible structures that trapped human attention found himself inside one that offered no exit he could see. And the most devastating truth left behind was not philosophical, but human. That understanding the trap does not guarantee survival, and that insight, no matter how deep, does not always come with mercy. If even clarity cannot protect a person from unbearable pain, what does that say about the limits of responsibility, endurance, and choice? After the collapse, there was a brief period that looked, from the outside, like recovery. Wallace returned to routines. He adjusted schedules. He tried alternative treatments. He walked. He limited stimulation. He reduced obligations. There was no grand comeback narrative, only an attempt to make life smaller and therefore survivable. This was not hope in the cinematic sense. It was containment, and containment, for a time, seemed possible. Teaching became the last stable structure. Classrooms were predictable. Students were focused. Discussion had boundaries. Within those limits, Wallace could function. He was attentive, careful, generous with feedback. He spoke about writing not as expression, but as responsibility, an act that required honesty without exhibitionism. The classroom offered something his public life did not: presence without performance. For a few hours at a time, the mind slowed enough to hold. Writing, however, did not return in the way it once had. The pressure produced another defining work lingered like static. Every attempt felt loaded with expectation, his own most of all. Pages came, but they were heavy. Revisions stalled. The fear was not failure, but misrepresentation, saying something untrue or worse, trivial. He did not want to add noise to a world already saturated with it. Silence felt safer, even if it carried its own cost. This period is often misread as withdrawal. It was not retreat from effort. It was triage. Wallace understood that his margins were thin. Any overextension could tip the balance. Invitations were declined. Travel was minimized. Interviews disappeared. The public Wallace faded, not out of disdain, but out of necessity. What looked like disappearance was actually conservation. There were moments, small and spectacular, when life felt almost workable. A conversation that did not exhaust him. A class that went well. A day where sleep arrived before dawn. These moments mattered. They suggested that existence without constant emergency might be possible. But they were fragile. Each depended on conditions aligning just right, and conditions rarely stayed aligned. The central tension remained unresolved. Wallace wanted to live truthfully. He also wanted relief. He wanted to contribute without being consumed. He wanted connection without exposure. These were not unreasonable desires, but they pulled in opposing directions. To write deeply meant reopening channels that led straight back into pain. To avoid writing meant losing the one language he trusted to make sense of that pain. Either choice carried loss. What makes this phase difficult to narrate is the absence of transformation. There was no clear ascent, no lesson learned that altered the trajectory. Just endurance, just days managed, then managed again. The culture prefers stories of recovery because they reassure us that suffering follows rules. Wallace's life resisted that reassurance. Improvement did not accumulate. Stability did not compound. Every gain was provisional. Friends noticed the strain even in quiet. He was thinner, more careful, more guarded, not defeated, but constrained. The intelligence remained intact. The humor surfaced occasionally, but the ease never returned. The cost of staying alive had risen, and the resources to pay it were finite. In retrospect, this period is sometimes framed as a misrescue. That framing misunderstands the nature of the struggle. Wallace was not waiting to be saved. He was working constantly to remain. The effort simply exceeded what one person could sustain indefinitely. There was no single decision that determined the outcome. There was accumulation. The idea of renewal hovered but never solidified. Renewal implies a return to form, a re-entry into previous capacities. Wallace's reality was different. The goal was not renewal, but reduction, reducing harm, reducing demand, reducing exposure. That the strategy eventually failed does not invalidate it. It clarifies the scale of what he was facing. What remains difficult and necessary to accept is that some turning points do not turn. They only narrow. And when a life becomes a corridor with fewer and fewer exits, the question shifts from possibility to endurance. How long can a person carry clarity without relief, discipline without rest, responsibility without reprieve? After his death in 2008, the world did what it often does too late. It read David Foster Wallace more carefully. The work did not change, but the angle of attention did. Passages once praised for brilliance were now read as signals, warnings, maps drawn by someone walking the terrain, while describing it. Infinite Jest was no longer only a novel about addiction and entertainment. It became a document of lived experience, a record of how consciousness can turn against itself when attention is fragmented and desire is endlessly redirected. This is Water took on a different gravity. What had sounded like gentle advice now felt like a final offering. Not a solution, but a practice. Choose what you pay attention to. Choose how you interpret the ordinary. Not because it will save you, but because it might make the day survivable. Readers shared the speech widely, often without knowing the full context of the man who delivered it. The words traveled further than Wallace ever wanted to, carrying a calm he struggled to access himself. In academic and literary circles, his reputation solidified. He was discussed not just as a stylist, but as a moral thinker, someone who believed fiction had obligations, someone who rejected irony when it became a shield against feeling. His essays were taught as models of observation without cruelty, humor without evasion. Students found in his work a permission to care deeply in a culture that often treats care as weakness. But admiration carried a shadow. Many wondered whether celebrating his insight risked sanctifying his suffering. There was discomfort, too, in the public conversation around his death. Simplifications appeared quickly: genius as burden, intelligence as curse, tragedy as inevitable. These narratives were tempting because they made the ending feel fated, tidy, comprehensible. Wallace resisted tidy explanations in life. Reducing him to one in death did him no favors. His illness was not the cost of brilliance. It was an illness. Full stop. What remains powerful about his legacy is not the manner of his death, but the honesty of his attention. Wallace wrote as if paying attention were an ethical act, as if noticing clearly, without flinching, mattered even when it hurt. He did not offer redemption arcs. He offered recognition. He named experiences many people live privately and assume are unshareable. In doing so, he made loneliness slightly less solitary. Readers continue to find themselves in his sentences, not because he solved their problems, but because he refused to lie about them. He acknowledged the difficulty of staying present in a world engineered to distract. He admitted that awareness could be painful. He still argued that it was preferable to numbness. That argument remains unresolved. It was unresolved for him. That may be why it continues to resonate. His legacy, then, is not instruction but companionship, not answers but articulation. He did not tell readers how to escape the maze. He showed them that they were not imagining its walls. And sometimes that recognition is the difference between isolation and endurance. If a writer can do that for someone they never meet, what kind of life does that count as? David Foster Wallace understood the machinery of modern life with rare precision. He saw how pleasure replaces meaning, how attention fragments into exhaustion, how choice can become a trap. He also understood something harder to accept. That understanding does not grant immunity. Insight does not cancel illness. Clarity does not guarantee mercy. There is a temptation to ask what he could have done differently, as if the right combination of effort, care, or awareness might have produced a different ending. That question comforts us because it preserves the idea of control. Wallace's life challenges that comfort. It suggests limits, real ones, on responsibility, endurance, and choice. What he offered instead was honesty. He wrote without pretending that pain is instructive or that suffering earns meaning by itself. He paid attention anyway. He described what he saw anyway. And in doing so, he left behind something quieter and more durable than inspiration, recognition. If his work continues to matter, it is not because it rescues, but because it accompanies. It sits with readers in the ordinary pressure of days, in the moments when thinking feels heavy and relief feels distant. And perhaps the final, unresolved question his life leaves us with is not how to overcome pain, but how gently we might treat ourselves and each other while carrying it.